Once upon a time, long before Netflix, but just after jousting went out of fashion, the Tudor Court was the hottest mess in England. Kings married like they were speed dating. Queens lost their heads, literally, and everyone from the stable boy to the archbishop had a scandal tucked under their doublet. It was a place where secrets were currency, codpieces were conversation starters, and bedtime was just another excuse to plot your next affair. So fluff your pillow, dim the candlelight, and prepare to be lulled into slumber by tales of royal whispers, velvet betrayals, and the kind of drama that makes modern reality TV look like a church picnic. This is history, bold, ridiculous, and sleepy. Welcome to the Tudor Court, where even the ghosts gossip. And hey, before you drift off into dreams of powdered wigs and poisoned pears, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which kingdom you're tuning in. Are you watching from the Highlands, the Lowlands, or just hiding behind a tapestry in Hampton Court, in a kingdom where the air smelled faintly of roast swan and political ambition? A young man named Henry Tudor woke up one morning and decided to become a king. Not just any king, a king with swagger, with calves so famously shapely they deserved their own heraldry, and with a codpiece so bold it could be seen from Calais. It was 1509, and England was about to get a monarch who treated marriage like a seasonal sport and diplomacy like a drinking game. Henry VIII was 17, handsome, and had just inherited the throne from his father, Henry VII, a man so frugal he once reused a coronation robe and considered smiling a taxable offense. Henry, however, was not frugal. He was a walking festival. He loved music, jousting, feasting, and flirting. His court was less a place of governance and more a Renaissance reality show. The velvet crown sat heavy on his head, but not so heavy that he couldn't dance with it on. His first royal act, marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, because nothing says romance like my brother's leftovers. The Pope gave a thumbs up, the nobles raised their goblets, and Henry declared it true love, until it wasn't. The Tudor court, meanwhile, was adjusting to its new king with a mix of awe and anxiety. Servants whispered about his temper, courtiers practiced compliments in the mirror, and one ambitious cardinal named Thomas Wolsey began plotting how to become the king's right-hand man, preferably without ever touching an actual hand. Henry's days were filled with tournaments, poetry, and the occasional execution. His nights? Well, let us just say the royal bedchamber had more drama than a Shakespearean tragedy performed by drunk actors. The velvet crown may have symbolized power, but it also came with a side of paranoia, a sprinkle of scandal, and a generous dollop of insomnia. And so began the reign of Henry VIII, a king who would marry 6 times, break from the Catholic Church, and still find time to compose love songs. His court would become a swirling vortex of secrets, seduction, and suspiciously timed illnesses. But for now, he was just a young man with a throne, a dream, and a tailor who charged by the yard. In the grand game of Tudor chess, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was the bishop who thought he was the king. He rose from humble beginnings. His father was a butcher with a suspiciously poetic flair for slicing ham, and climbed the ranks of the church like a man late for dinner. Wolsey was brilliant, ambitious, and had a wardrobe so luxurious it made kings look underdressed. His robes were crimson, his sleeves were wide enough to host a banquet, and his hat looked like it had its own zip code. He didn't walk through court, He glided like a velvet iceberg of influence. Henry VIII adored him, at least at first. Wolsey knew how to flatter, how to scheme, and most importantly, how to make things happen. Need a treaty? Wolsey had a scroll for that. Need a party? Wolsey could summon 100 musicians and a roast peacock wearing a crown. Need a divorce from your first wife, so you can marry a woman who winked at you once across a tapestry. Wolsey would try. Oh, how he would try. But the Pope wasn't having it. Divorce wasn't trendy in Rome, and Catherine of Aragon had powerful relatives. Wolsey, caught between Henry's tantrums and the Vatican's stubbornness, began to sweat, not visibly, of course. His robes were lined with antiperspirant silk, but spiritually, he was drenched. He whispered. He plotted. He sent letters. He begged. He bribed. He even tried to argue theology with theologians, which is like trying to outbake a baker using a spoon and a prayer. But it wasn't enough. Henry grew impatient. Anne Boleyn grew smug. And Wolsey, once the most powerful man in England, not wearing a crown, found himself slipping. The whisper turned into silence. He was stripped of his titles, his palaces, and his dignity. He was sent north to sulk in exile, with only his memories and a few loyal servants who still believed his hat deserved respect. He died on the way back to London, heartbroken and probably still composing a speech that would be saved him if only he'd arrived in time. Cardinal Wolsey, the man who whispered to kings, danced with power, and wore robes so grand they could double as tents. His rise was meteoric. His fall was tragic. His legacy? A cautionary tale wrapped in velvet. Anne Boleyn wasn't supposed to be queen. She wasn't even supposed to be noticed. She was meant to be a lady in waiting, a decorative accessory in the background of court life, like a vase or a particularly well-dressed fern. But Anne had ambition, charm, and a neck that would one day become tragically famous. She arrived at court with French flair, sharp wit, and eyes that could slice through a man's resolve, like a hot knife through buttered gossip. Henry VIII, already married to Catherine of Aragon and growing increasingly allergic to patience, spotted Anne across a crowded hall and promptly forgot how marriage worked. Anne didn't flirt. She strategized. She didn't giggle. She negotiated. She dangled affection like a carrot on a velvet string. And Henry chased it with the enthusiasm of a man who had never been told no before. She refused to be his mistress. She wanted a crown. And Henry, bewitched and bewildered, decided to give her one, even if it meant rewriting the rules of religion. The court buzzed. Nobles whispered. Catherine prayed harder. And Anne, she winked again. Henry broke from Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and married Anne in a ceremony that felt less sacred and more like a very expensive tantrum. She was crowned queen, dressed in gold, and paraded through London like a victorious general, though some spectators muttered that she looked more like a very confident scandal. But queenship was not a fairy tale. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day rule with unmatched brilliance, but Henry wanted a son. The pressure mounted. The court grew colder. Anne's sharp tongue, once charming, became dangerous. Her enemies multiplied like rabbits in spring. Then came the accusations: adultery, incest, treason. The charges were as believable as a goose in armor, but they stuck. Anne was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. She faced the scaffold with grace, dignity, and a final speech that made even the executioner hesitate. Her neck, famously slender, met the blade of a French swordsman, chosen for his precision because Henry was feeling sentimental. Anne Boleyn, the queen who winked, who rose like a comet and fell like a whisper. Her story is bold, tragic, and laced with the kind of drama that makes bedtime deliciously dangerous. The Tudor Court was less a place of governance and more a high-stakes gossip lounge with velvet curtains. Beneath the grandeur, gold-threaded tapestries, jewel-encrusted goblets, and suspiciously large feathered hats lay a network of whispers so intricate it made spiderwebs look amateur. Servants knew everything. They were the true intelligence agency of the realm. Chambermaids traded secrets like playing cards. Stable boys overheard confessions while brushing horses. Even the royal falconer once leaked a scandal after a particularly chatty hawk repeated something it should not have. At the center of this whispering whirlwind was Lady Margaret Maggie Fizzlebottom, unofficial queen of gossip. She had ears sharper than a dagger, and a memory like a ledger. She could recall who kissed whom behind which tapestry, in which corridor, on which Tuesday. She didn't write things down. She embroidered them into her handkerchiefs. The court's favorite pastime wasn't dancing or diplomacy. It was speculation. Who was pregnant? Who was plotting? Who had mysteriously developed a rash after eating the royal pears? Every glance, every cough, every slightly too long handshake was dissected like a frog in a schoolroom. Henry VIII, of course, pretended not to notice, but he did. He had spies, watching his spies. He once disguised himself as a commoner to eavesdrop on a dinner party, only to be recognized by his calves. They were simply too majestic to be mistaken. Anne Boleyn's rise had supercharged the gossip economy. Was she a witch? A seductress? A political genius? Did she really keep a sixth finger hidden under her glove? Or was that just a particularly aggressive ring? The rumors swirled like cream in royal tea. Even the kitchens weren't safe. The pastry chef once baked a pie shaped like a bishop's hat, which was interpreted as a political statement. He claimed it was just a creative flourish. He was reassigned to turnip duty. But the gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was power. A well-placed rumor could ruin a noble, elevate a mistress, or trigger a diplomatic incident. The court was a theater, and every whisper was a line in the play. The court of gossip, a place where secrets were currency, silence was suspicious, and even the shadows had something to say. The royal bedchamber, a place where dreams were dreamt, alliances were forged, and occasionally, someone snored loud enough to start a diplomatic incident. To the casual observer, it was just a room, albeit one with velvet drapes, gold-threaded pillows, and a mattress so stuffed with goose feathers it could double as a cloud. But in the Tudor Court, the bedchamber was the epicenter of intrigue. It was where monarchs slept, schemed, sulked, and sometimes seduced. It was less a place of rest, and more a stage for the most intimate performances in politics. Henry VIII's bedchamber was a rotating carousel of drama. One night, it hosted a romantic serenade. The next, a heated argument about succession, followed by a suspiciously timed stomach ache. The king's attendants, known as the gentlemen of the privy chamber, were part valet, part therapist, part emergency gossip hotline. They dressed him, undressed him, and occasionally pretended not to notice when he muttered about Anne Boleyn in his sleep. The bed itself was a masterpiece. Carved oak, embroidered canopy, and enough space to host a small jousting match. It was where Henry wooed his wives, sulked over his lack of sons, and once allegedly threw a pillow at a portrait of the Pope. The sheets were changed daily, the candles replaced hourly, and the secrets whispered nightly. But it wasn't just Henry. Every monarch had their own bedchamber quirks. Elizabeth I, for example, insisted on sleeping surrounded by books, maps, and a small army of ladies-in-waiting who were trained to interpret her dreams. One famously claimed Elizabeth dreamt of a lion wearing a bishop's hat, which was taken as a sign to raise taxes. The bedchamber was also a hotbed of espionage. Servants were bribed. Chamber pots were searched. One ambitious noble once hid behind a curtain for 6 hours just to hear the Queen sneeze. He claimed it was a coded message. It wasn't. And let's not forget the bedchamber etiquette. Entering without permission was a crime. Entering with permission, but without a flattering compliment, was a social faux pas. Entering with garlic breath? Treasonous. The royal one. A place where sleep was optional, secrets were abundant, and even the pillows had political opinions. If the Tudor Court were a play, Jane Seymour would be the character who enters quietly, says very little, and somehow steals the entire show. She was Henry VIII's third wife, and unlike her predecessors, she didn't arrive with fireworks or scandal. No winks, no theological debates, no suspiciously poetic codpieces, just a calm demeanor, a modest smile, and a knack for surviving court politics by saying absolutely nothing controversial. Jane was the human equivalent of chamomile tea. Henry met her while still married to Anne Boleyn, which, let's be honest, was becoming a habit. Jane didn't flirt. She didn't protest. She simply stood there, radiating serenity, like a particularly holy lamp. Henry was smitten. Anne was doomed. And Jane, quietly, became queen. Her reign was short, but significant. She gave Henry what he wanted most, a son. Prince Edward arrived after a long labor, and Henry celebrated like he just won the medieval lottery. There were feasts, fireworks, and one unfortunate incident involving a jester and a roast swan. Jane, exhausted but triumphant, lay in bed surrounded by flowers and praise. Then she died. 12 days after childbirth, Jane slipped away, leaving behind a grieving king, a newborn heir, and a court suddenly unsure how to gossip about someone who hadn't caused a scandal. Henry was devastated. He wore black. He commissioned portraits. He even stopped flirting. For a week, Jane became a legend, the true queen, the one who gave him a son and didn't argue. Her ghost, they say, still wanders the halls of Hampton Court, dressed in white, clutching a candle, and occasionally sighing at the state of modern upholstery. Servants claimed to hear her footsteps. Nobles swore they saw her reflection in the silverware. One cook insisted she rearranged the spice rack. Whether true or not, Jane's presence lingered. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly powerful. Jane Seymour, the queen who whispered her way into history, gave England its air, and left behind a ghost story gentle enough to tuck you in. If Tinder had existed in the 16th century, Henry VIII would have swiped left on Anne of Cleves. Hard. It all began with a portrait. Henry, newly widowed, again, was in the market for a politically advantageous bride. Enter Thomas Cromwell, his ever-eager advisor, who suggested Anne of Cleves, a German princess with excellent Protestant credential and Allegedly, a face that could launch 1,000 treaties. But Henry was picky. He didn't want just any bride. He wanted beauty, charm, and someone who wouldn't argue about codpiece etiquette. So, he requested a portrait. The artist, Hans Holbein, painted Anne with all the flattery of a man who knew his paycheck depended on it. The result? A vision of elegance, grace, and cheekbones so sharp they could slice diplomatic tension. Henry was smitten. He declared the match perfect. The wedding was arranged. Anne sailed to England. And then Henry met her. It was awkward. She didn't look like the portrait. She didn't act like the portrait. She didn't even smell like the portrait, which Henry later described as foreign. He was horrified. Anne, meanwhile, was confused. She'd been told Henry was charming. Instead, she met a grumpy monarch with gout and a tendency to insult people before breakfast. The wedding went ahead. Barely. Henry sulked through the ceremony. Anne blinked a lot. The court held its breath. The marriage was never consummated, which in Tudor terms meant it was basically a long, expensive handshake. Henry blamed everyone. Cromwell was demoted. Holbein avoided eye contact. Anne, surprisingly, thrived. She agreed to an annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and spent the rest of her life as the King's beloved sister, a title that came with land, income, and zero marital obligations. She outlived Henry. She outlived all his other wives. She attended royal events, wore fashionable hats, and never again had to pose for a portrait. Anne of Cleves, the queen who dodged a bullet, turned a failed marriage into a comfortable retirement, and proved that sometimes swiping left is the wisest move of all. If the Tudor court were a masquerade ball, Catherine Howard would be the girl twirling too close to the fire. She was young, very young. Some say she was barely out of childhood when she caught Henry VIII's eye. Others say she was old enough to know better, but too charming to care. Either way, she danced into the king's heart with a giggle, a curtsy, and a flirtatious flick of her fan. Henry, now aging, limping, and shaped like a particularly regal barrel, was enchanted. Catherine was everything Anne of Cleves wasn't: lively, affectionate, and fluent in the art of flattery. She called him her rose without a thorn, which was either poetic or wildly inaccurate. Depending on your view of his personality, the court blinked. Catherine twirled. Henry married her. She became queen, and the palace bloomed with music, laughter, and suspiciously long walks in the garden. Catherine loved dancing, dressing up, and, allegedly, other men. Her past, it turned out, was a bit more crowded than Henry preferred. Old flames resurfaced. Letters were discovered. One gentleman claimed he'd been promised marriage. Another claimed he'd been promised something less formal. Henry was not amused. The investigation began. The court turned cold. Catherine, once the belle of the ball, found herself surrounded by silence and side eyes. Her ladies-in-waiting were interrogated. Her rooms were searched. Her heart, once light as lace, grew heavy. She was arrested, charged with adultery and treason, and sent to the Tower of London. Legend says she asked for the execution block the night before her death, so she could practice laying her head upon it. Whether true or not, it's the kind of detail that makes history feel like a ghost story. She was beheaded at just 17 or 19, depending on which historian you ask. Her final words were said to be a prayer, a plea, and a whisper of regret. Catherine Howard, the queen who danced too close to danger, who loved too freely, and whose story reminds us that even the brightest twirls can end in shadow. By the time Catherine Parr entered the royal picture, Henry VIII was less a romantic hero and more a historical cautionary tale. With a limp, he'd burned through 5 wives, 2 of whom had been beheaded, 1 annulled, 1 dead in childbirth, and 1 mysteriously vanished into comfortable retirement. The court had started placing bets on how long the next one would last. Enter Catherine Parr, intelligent, composed, and fluent in Latin, theology, and the art of not getting executed. She wasn't just a queen. She was a nurse, a scholar, and a woman who could debate scripture while applying ointment to Henry's gouty leg. She didn't arrive with flirtation or fanfare. She arrived with books, patience, and a deep understanding of how to survive a man who thought marriage vows were more like seasonal guidelines. Henry was older, heavier, and increasingly cranky. Catherine soothed him with gentle conversation, theological discussions, and a firm refusal to argue about codpieces. She was his 6th wife, and she intended to be his last. But even Catherine wasn't immune to court drama. She had strong Protestant views, which made her a target for Catholic factions. At one point, a warrant for her arrest was drafted, accusing her of heresy. Catherine, upon hearing of it, promptly fainted, a classic Tudor defense maneuver, then visited Henry and apologized for being too scholarly. He forgave her. The warrant was quietly burned. The court pretended it never happened. She outlived Henry. When he died, she didn't mourn publicly. She packed up her books, her dignity, and married Thomas Seymour, a man with charm, ambition, and the emotional maturity of a decorative spoon. That marriage was less restful, but at least it didn't involve execution. Catherine Parr was the only one of Henry's wives to write and publish books. She was the only one to survive him, and she was the only one who managed to turn the role of queen into something resembling a career in diplomacy, nursing, and literary achievement. Catherine Parr, the final wife, the wise survivor, and the woman who proved that sometimes the best way to win the game is simply to outlast everyone else. In the Tudor Court, paper was never just paper. It was a battlefield, a confessional, a flirtation device, and occasionally a very expensive napkin. And when it came to secrets, nothing beat a well-folded letter sealed with wax and scandal. The art of letter writing in Henry VIII's time was less about communication and more about coded survival. Courtiers didn't just write, they encrypted. They used lemon juice for invisible ink, folded messages into origami-like shapes, and hid them in places so obscure even the rats had trouble finding them. One page boy, young Thomas Tittlewhip, became famous for delivering secret letters tucked inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Another noblewoman once disguised a love note as a shopping list for gooseberries and medicinal herbs. The recipient read it by candlelight and promptly fainted from romantic overwhelm. Henry himself was no stranger to secret correspondence. His letters to Anne Boleyn were filled with flowery declarations, awkward metaphors, and one particularly infamous line about her pretty duckies, which historians still debate. Were they earrings, her eyes, or just a very unfortunate nickname? Elizabeth I, years later, mastered the art of political letter writing. Her notes were sharp, elegant, and laced with enough ambiguity to make entire councils argue for days. She once wrote to a suitor, "I am yours, not yours, and yet yours, which caused 3 ambassadors to resign out of sheer confusion. But not all secret letters were romantic. Some were treasonous, some were desperate, some were written in code so complex that decoding them required a monk, a mathematician, and a very patient cat. One such letter, discovered behind a tapestry, simply read, "The pears are ripe." It triggered a rebellion. No one knows why. The Tower of London had a special drawer for intercepted letters. It was labeled "Suspicious Correspondence" and contained everything from love poems to doodles of suspiciously pointy hats. The guards occasionally read them aloud for entertainment, adding dramatic flair and interpretive dance. The secret letters of the Tudor Court, folded in haste, sealed with hope, and written in the ink of ambition. They whispered through history, fluttered through corridors, and sometimes, just sometimes, changed the fate of a kingdom. Elizabeth I was born into scandal, crowned in uncertainty, and ruled with a wink and a dagger hidden in her fan. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the queen who lost her head, and Henry VIII, the king who lost his patience. Her childhood was a masterclass in survival. One day a princess, the next declared illegitimate, and always surrounded by whispers. She learned early that in the Tudor court, silence was safer than sentiment. When she finally became queen, England held its breath. Would she marry? Would she rule? Would she spontaneously combust from sheer political pressure? Elizabeth answered with style, strategy, and a wardrobe so elaborate it required its own staff. She never married. She claimed she was married to England, which was either poetic or a clever way to avoid sharing her throne or her closet. Suitors came and went, princes, dukes, and one particularly persistent Frenchman who sent her a mechanical frog. She thanked him politely and never called back. Her court was a swirling dance of flirtation and diplomacy. She surrounded herself with clever men, loyal women, and enough spies to make a hedgehog nervous. Her favorite, Robert Dudley, was handsome, charming, and married to someone who mysteriously fell down the stairs. The scandal was so juicy, it practically dripped onto the royal carpets. Elizabeth handled it all with grace and a touch of theatrical flair. She gave speeches that made grown men cry. She rode into battle, wearing armor and pearls. She once told Parliament, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." The room erupted. Someone fainted. The quote was embroidered onto cushions. But beneath the glitter and glory was a woman who never stopped calculating. She trusted few, forgave fewer, and kept her emotions folded neatly between layers of lace. Her letters were masterpieces of ambiguity. Her portraits were carefully curated. Her legacy? A golden age wrapped in mystery. Elizabeth I, the queen who ruled alone, loved carefully, and turned her life into the most elegant enigma in English history. Robert Dudley was the kind of man who made courtiers, nervous, and poets overly dramatic. Tall, dashing, and perpetually dressed like he'd just stepped out of a romantic painting. He was Queen Elizabeth I's favorite, and possibly more. Their relationship was the court's favorite mystery. Were they lovers? Friends? Political allies with matching wardrobes? No one knew for sure, and Elizabeth wasn't telling. She smiled when asked, changed the subject, and once responded with, "I do not answer questions posed by men wearing feathered hats." Dudley, meanwhile, basked in the attention. He danced with the queen, rode beside her in processions, and built a country estate so lavish it made visiting ambassadors weep with envy. He was given titles, lands, and the kind of proximity to power that made other nobles twitch. But then came the dilemma. Dudley was married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived far from court, in a quiet manor with suspiciously creaky stairs. One day, she was found dead at the bottom of those stairs. The cause? Accidental fall, said the official report. Convenient, said everyone else. The scandal exploded. Whispers filled the palace. Was it murder? Was it suicide? Was it just a tragic case of Tudor architecture? No one could prove anything, but the damage was done. Elizabeth, ever cautious, distanced herself. Dudley's hopes of marrying the Queen evaporated like perfume in a drafty corridor. Still, he remained close. He was loyal, charming, and occasionally sent Elizabeth gifts so extravagant they required their own footmen. She never married, and he never stopped trying. Their bond was deep, complicated, and laced with the kind of tension that made historians write entire books while sighing dramatically. Dudley eventually married again, twice in fact, but neither union had the sparkle of his connection with Elizabeth. He died before her, and when she heard the news, she locked herself in her chambers and refused to eat for days. The court tiptoed, the servants wept, the poets wrote sonnets so overwrought they were banned from breakfast readings. Robert Dudley, the Queen's favorite, the court's enigma, and the man whose love story was written not in vows, but in glances across candlelit halls. If the Tudor court was a stage, then Sir Francis Walsingham was the man behind the curtain, pulling strings and catching traitors with the finesse of a cat burglar in a cassock. Walsingham wasn't flashy. He didn't wear feathers or flirt at banquets. He preferred shadows, silence, and documents that smelled faintly of danger. One famously posed as a lute player and uncovered a plot to poison the Queen's marmalade. The marmalade was saved. The lute was confiscated. Walsingham's favorite tool? Cipher. He loved a good code. He trained cryptographers to turn royal gossip into mathematical puzzles. Messages were written in lemon juice, folded into books, and delivered by pigeons with suspiciously smug expressions. One pigeon was knighted. It was later revealed to be a regular pigeon with a very confident handler. Plots against Elizabeth were frequent and dramatic. Catholic factions wanted her gone. Foreign powers wanted her replaced. One group tried to smuggle a coded message inside a meat pie. It was intercepted, decoded, and served at a banquet with extra irony. The most famous plot, the Babington plot, involved a group of young men with more enthusiasm than subtlety. They planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Walsingham let them think they were succeeding, then pounced with the precision of a Tudor hawk. The conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed. Mary herself was implicated, and her fate sealed with a signature and a sigh. Walsingham's methods weren't always gentle. He believed in torture, surveillance, and the occasional dramatic reveal. But he kept Elizabeth alive, England stable, and the court buzzing with paranoia. He died with little fanfare, buried beneath layers of secrets and a ledger full of names no one dared read aloud. The spy network, a web of whispers, a dance of deception, and the reason the Tudor Court slept with one eye open. In the Tudor Court, entertainment was never just entertainment. Beneath the music, the laughter, and the suspiciously well-timed fireworks lay a world of coded glances, whispered alliances, and masks that hid more than powdered noses. Masks were the height of courtly drama, lavish performances where nobles dressed as gods, shepherds, or occasionally very confused vegetables. They danced, they sang, they recited verses so flowery they made the tapestries blush. But behind the glitter and grease paint, real plots unfolded. Elizabeth Ross adored masks. She hosted them often, using them to dazzle ambassadors, distract rivals, and occasionally flirt with poetic ambiguity. One famous mask featured a scene where a queen banished a traitor with a flick of her fan. The audience clapped. The traitor in question quietly packed his bags. Costumes were elaborate. One noble dressed as Mercury, complete with wings and a scroll of suspiciously specific policy suggestions. Another came as a lion, which was impressive until he tripped over his tail and knocked over a bishop. The bishop forgave him. The lion was reassigned to fruit carving. But the real drama happened backstage. Servants whispered. Courtiers schemed. One lady-in-waiting once swapped a prop scroll with a real letter revealing a secret affair. The actor read it aloud. The audience gasped. The affair ended. The scroll was baked into a pie for symbolic closure. Even the musicians weren't safe. A lute player was caught passing notes between verses. A drummer used his instrument to signal coded messages. One harpist claimed his melody was a warning to France. France ignored it. The harpist was promoted. Elizabeth herself often participated, wearing masks so ornate they required scaffolding. She played goddesses, virtues, and once, a phoenix, rising from a pile of diplomatic paperwork. Her performances were praised, analyzed, and occasionally feared. One ambassador described her as terrifyingly poetic. He was never invited back. The Mask of Secrets, a stage where truth wore costumes, lies danced gracefully, and every performance was a rehearsal for survival. The Tower of London wasn't just a fortress. It was a witness. Its stone walls had seen kings crowned and queens condemned. It had hosted coronation feasts and execution breakfasts. It was the Tudor Court's most dramatic character, silent, cold, and always listening. Originally built to protect, the tower became a place of fear. If you were sent there, you weren't going for the view. You were going because someone, somewhere, had whispered your name with just enough suspicion to make your life very complicated. Anne Boleyn walked its halls, her footsteps light, her fate heavy. She joked with her ladies, prayed in her cell, and met her end with grace, so chilling it made the executioner hesitate. Her ghost, they say, still wanders the grounds, head held high, heart unbroken. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, spent her final days in the tower too. She was young, scholarly, and tragically caught in a political tug-of-war. She read Plato until the morning of her execution, then stepped onto the scaffold with the quiet dignity of someone who knew history would remember her better than her captors. Even Elizabeth I was imprisoned there once. Before she wore the crown, she arrived under suspicion, accused of treason, and stared out the barred windows, wondering if she'd ever see sunlight or satin. again. She survived, of course, and later ruled with the kind of fire that made the tower tremble. The yeoman warders, known as beefeaters, guarded the place with stoic pride. They knew the stories. They whispered them to each other over tankards of ale. One claimed he saw a raven recite Latin. Another swore he heard Anne Boleyn humming. The truth, somewhere between superstition and sleeplessness. The tower held secrets, letters hidden in floorboards, confessions scratched into stone. One prisoner carved a poem so beautiful it was mistaken for a prayer. Another left behind a chessboard made of bread crusts and regret. The tower's tales, stories etched in silence, wrapped in fog, and whispered by walls that never forget. In the Tudor court, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was politics, personality, and occasionally passive aggression stitched in silk. The royal wardrobe was a kingdom unto itself, a vast chamber filled with bolts of velvet, barrels of pearls, and enough lace to strangle a small rebellion. It was managed by a team of tailors, embroiderers, and one very stern woman named Mistress Thimble, who could identify a noble's rank by the shimmer of their hem. Henry VIII's wardrobe was legendary. He wore doublets so padded they could deflect arrows, codpieces so bold they required their own introductions, and cloaks lined with fur from animals, so exotic they probably had diplomatic immunity. One outfit featured 12,000 gold threads and a collar so wide it blocked sunlight for nearby courtiers. Elizabeth elevated fashion to an art form and a weapon. Her gowns were masterpieces, stiff bodices, towering ruffs, and sleeves that could host diplomatic negotiations. She used color like a monarch uses armies. White for purity, crimson for power, black for mourning or intimidation. Her wardrobe was so vast, it had its own inventory scroll, which read less like a closet and more like a treasure map. But fashion wasn't just for monarchs. Courtiers competed in a silent war of fabrics. One noble wore a hat so tall it scraped the chapel ceiling. Another arrived at a banquet, dressed entirely in peacock feathers. He was asked to leave when the Queen's falcon became agitated. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Velvet was for the elite, silk for the nearly elite, wool for everyone else. One ambitious merchant tried to wear satin and was fined enough to fund a small bridge. He wore burlap for the rest of his life. The wardrobe also held secrets, hidden pockets for love letters, embroidered symbols of loyalty or rebellion. One lady-in-waiting stitched a coded message into her petticoat. It was discovered when she fainted dramatically and her skirt flared with treason. The royal wardrobe, a place where fashion spoke louder than words, where every stitch was a statement, and where dressing for court meant dressing for survival. If patience were a crown jewel, Catherine of Aragon would have worn it on her forehead. She was the first wife of Henry VIII, and by all accounts, the most regal, most devout, and most tragically patient woman to ever share a bed with a man who thought fidelity was a seasonal suggestion. Catherine had already been married once, to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who promptly died after 5 months of marriage. Rumor had it he caught a chill, though some whispered it was the shock of marriage itself. Either way, Catherine found herself widowed, stranded in England, and stuck in limbo like a royal sock missing its pair. Enter Henry, young, dashing, and freshly crowned. He married Catherine, with the Pope's blessing, and a vague shrug from the clergy. Sure, they said, What could possibly go wrong? At first, it was bliss. Catherine was intelligent, graceful, and fluent in Latin, which made her the only person at court who could read the fine print on royal treaties. Henry adored her, until he didn't. You see, Catherine's womb was as politically important as her crown, and after several pregnancies, only one child survived, a daughter named Mary. Henry, convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, began to sulk. Not the quiet kind of sulk, but the loud, dramatic, I'm going to rewrite church doctrine kind. Catherine, meanwhile, remained calm. She prayed. She embroidered. She gave speeches so eloquent they made bishops weep into their goblets. But Henry was restless. He wanted a son. He wanted excitement. He wanted Anne Boleyn, who had eyes like daggers and a smile that could start a war. Catherine, ever dignified, refused to step aside. She argued her case before Parliament, before the Pope, and even before Henry himself, who responded by banishing her from court and pretending she didn't exist. Still, she waited. She waited in castles, in cold chambers, in exile. She wrote letters. She wore black. She never, ever admitted that her marriage was invalid. Even as Henry married Anne, declared himself head of the Church of England, and threw a theological tantrum that echoed across Europe, Catherine held firm. She died alone, still calling herself queen, still believing in her marriage, still waiting for Henry to come to his senses, which, spoiler alert, he never did. In the Tudor Court, nothing was ever just what it seemed, not even a pear. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the palace kitchens were humming with activity. The Queen's feast was being prepared. Roasted swan, sugared violets, pies shaped like mythical beasts, and a bowl of perfectly polished pears. They gleamed like jewels, nestled in silver, waiting to be devoured. But one pear had a secret. No one knew who tampered with it. Was it a jealous noble? A foreign agent? A cook with a grudge and access to suspicious herbs? The poison was subtle, tasteless, odorless, and slow. It didn't kill instantly. It whispered through the bloodstream, like a rumor with teeth. The pear was served to Lord Everley, a charming diplomat with a talent for flattery and a tendency to win arguments with a raised eyebrow. He bit into it during a toast to peace. By dessert, he was pale. By midnight, he was gone. The court panicked. The kitchens were searched. The pear bowl was interrogated. Mistress Thimble, from the wardrobe, claimed she saw a shadow near the fruit tray. The falconer insisted his bird had squawked in warning. The jester blamed the pears for being too smug. Elizabeth I remained calm. She ordered an investigation, summoned her spy master, and stared at the remaining pears with the intensity of a queen who'd seen too many plots disguised as pudding. The culprit was never found. The bowl was melted down. Pears were banned from royal banquets for a decade, but the story lingered. Poets wrote verses about the fruit of betrayal. Children whispered about the ghost of the poisoned pear. One ambitious playwright turned it into a tragic comedy where the pear sang before being eaten. It was not a hit. The Poisoned Pear, a tale of sweetness turned sour, of elegance laced with danger, and of a court where even dessert could be deadly. By the twilight of Elizabeth I's reign, the court had grown quieter. The dances were slower, the whispers softer, and the queen herself, once radiant with youth and fire, now moved with the grace of memory. But even in her final years, Elizabeth's heart was not entirely retired. Enter Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, young, bold, and charming, in the way that made older courtiers sigh and younger ones sharpen their daggers. He was everything Elizabeth had once adored, reckless, poetic, and just dangerous enough to be interesting. Their connection was electric. He called her my prince. She called him sweet Robin. He burst into her chambers unannounced, kissed her hand with theatrical flair, and once argued with her so passionately that she threw a slipper at him. He kept it, framed it, showed it off at parties. But the court was no place for pure affection. Essex wanted power. Elizabeth wanted loyalty. He led military campaigns, some successful, some disastrous. He returned from Ireland without permission, barged into her presence, and found that the slipper-throwing days were over. She was furious. He was defiant. The affair turned sour. Then came the rebellion. Essex, convinced he could rally London to his cause, marched through the streets with a handful of confused followers and a very dramatic hat. The city did not rise. The rebellion fizzled. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated. She signed the warrant, then wept. She locked herself away, refused to eat, and stared at the mirror that had once reflected their laughter. When Essex was executed, she wore black for days and spoke little of him again. Some say she kept a locket with his portrait. Others claim she whispered his name in her sleep. The truth, like most Tudor tales, is wrapped in velvet and sealed with wax. The last affair, a love too bold for its time, too fragile for its throne, and too human to be forgotten. The Tudor dynasty, once ablaze with drama, ambition, and velvet-clad thunder, finally grew still. Elizabeth Ephemeris, the last Tudor monarch, ruled longer than any of her kin. She outlived her rivals, her suitors, and most of her secrets. When she died in 1603, the court didn't erupt. It hushed. The bells tolled, the courtiers wept, and the crown passed to a new house. The Tudors, for all their fire, had flickered into memory, but their sleep was not ordinary. Henry VII, the founder, rests beneath a marble tomb in Westminster Abbey, his hands folded, his legacy carved in Latin. He was cautious, calculating, and quietly victorious. His sleep is one of relief. Henry the Obeat lies nearby, buried beside Jane Seymour, the only wife to give him a son and escape his wrath. His tomb is grand, but unfinished. Like his dreams of dynasty, his sleep is heavy, like a banquet after dusk. Edward VI, the boy king, sleeps in silence. His reign was brief, his body frail, his hopes for Protestant glory tucked beneath embroidered stone. His sleep is gentle, like a page turned too soon. Mary Rye, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rests with dignity. Her reign was fiery, her faith unshaken, her legacy debated. Her sleep is solemn, like a candle burned low. Elizabeth Musk lies beneath a monument that towers with pride. She shares her tomb with Mary, her half-sister and former rival, a final reconciliation carved in stone. Her sleep is regal, wrapped in riddles, watched by angels. And so, the Tudors sleep, not forgotten, not forgiven, but remembered. Their dreams echo in corridors, their portraits blink in candlelight, and their stories drift through time like lullabies wrapped in lace. Now, dear listener, the saga is complete. The crowns are quiet, the swords are sheathed, the whispers have faded into velvet dusk. Close your eyes. Let the history settle, like dust on old parchment. The Tudors sleep now, and so should you. Good night.